I'd been hunting for years, but this trip felt different. It was just me this time. No buddies, no chatter, just the silence of the Pacific Northwest woods. I wanted the isolation, the challenge. I'd driven deeper into the forest than ever before, to a spot no one would bother me, far away from the usual trails. The trees here were thicker, darker, and the air had a stillness to it that made the world feel heavier. Setting up camp went smooth, but as I finished, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest was too quiet. Not the normal, peaceful quiet of nature, but a heavy, unnatural silence, like the whole place was holding its breath. No birds, no wind rustling the leaves, just me and the trees. I chalked it up to being alone. When you're used to people around, being solo can mess with your head. I shook it off, telling myself I came out here for the solitude. I was ready for the hunt, ready to escape everything for a while. At least that's what I thought. That first night, everything changed. I sat by the fire, letting the heat chase away the cold creeping through the forest. At first, the quiet was calming, almost peaceful. But as the sun disappeared completely and the shadows swallowed the trees, the atmosphere shifted. It started with a rustling in the distance, subtle at first. I figured it was just some animal, maybe a deer or raccoon moving through the brush. But the sound wasn't quite right. It was too deliberate, too cautious. It didn't have that randomness animals usually make when they're scurrying about. I stood up, flashlight in hand, and scanned the tree line, but all I saw was darkness. The rustling stopped, and the silence returned, thicker this time. I tried to shrug it off, told myself I was just jumpy. Being alone can mess with your mind. I went back to the fire, keeping my ears open for more sounds. But what happened next wasn't something I could ignore. Around midnight, just as I was about to turn in, I noticed flickering lights deep in the trees. At first, they were faint like fireflies or someone's flashlight, but they didn't behave like anything natural. The lights pulsed in a slow rhythm, almost like they were alive. I stood, watching them for what felt like minutes, but when I tried to focus, they vanished, like they had never been there at all. I told myself it had to be campers, though I hadn't seen a single sign of anyone else since I got here. Maybe it was my imagination, but something felt wrong. The forest didn't feel empty anymore, felt watched. I couldn't shake the sensation, like there were eyes in the dark, just beyond the reach of my light. Something was out there, and whatever it was, it didn't feel friendly. The next morning, I tried to shake off the weirdness from the night before. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that the flickering lights were some trick of the forest. But that uneasy feeling still lingered as I set off to hunt. I caught a glimpse of a deer's tracks not far from camp and decided to follow them deeper into the woods. The forest was dense, the trees packed tight, their branches forming a thick canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The quiet was back, pressing in on me from all sides. After about an hour of tracking, the woods opened up into a clearing I hadn't seen on any map. I froze at the edge, my breath catching in my throat. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. Animal remains, dozens of them, were scattered around the clearing, but not haphazardly. They were arranged, laid out in some kind of sick pattern. Bones, fur, even entire carcasses, all positioned in a way that sent a chill down my spine. The smell hit me next, the overwhelming stench of rot and decay, thick in the air, making it hard to breathe. My mind raced. Who would do something like this? And why here, so deep in the woods? My stomach churned as I realized that whatever or whoever was responsible might still be nearby. I could feel eyes on me, like the forest itself was watching. The peaceful isolation I'd sought now felt suffocating, like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare. I backed away slowly, trying not to make any noise, but every twig snap under my boots felt like an alarm. The urge to run hit me, but I didn't know which direction was safe. The deeper I went into the woods, the more I felt like I was being hunted. The forest was no longer my sanctuary. It had become a predator, and I was its prey. I pushed through the trees, trying to retrace my steps, but the forest had changed. The path I thought I'd come from wasn't there anymore. My heart pounded as I heard it, a distinct crunch of footsteps behind me. At first, they were distant, but with every turn, every frantic step, they got closer. I sped up, practically running now, but no matter how fast I moved, the presence was right behind me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw them, dark, humanoid shapes darting between the trees, too fast to focus on. My chest tightened with panic. The more I tried to find my way, the more lost I became. The forest felt like it was shifting, twisting, keeping me in its grasp. I was trapped, disoriented, and no matter which way I went, I couldn't shake the feeling of being stalked. Finally, I stumbled back into my camp, at least where it should have been. But something was wrong. My gear was gone. My car was gone. It was like I had never been here at all. And then, as the last light of day faded, the flickering lights returned. This time, they weren't distant. They circled me, closing in, and I knew then I was done for.
We arrived at the old hunting lodge just before dusk. It was exactly how I remembered it from when I was a kid. Isolated, worn, and surrounded by miles of dense Montana forest. The air was crisp, the silence heavy, like the land was holding on to some long-forgotten secret. While my parents and brothers unloaded the car, I felt an inexplicable pull toward the attic. The narrow staircase creaked under my weight as I made my way up, dust swirling in the dim light filtering through the lone attic window. I didn't know what I was looking for until I found it. An old leather-bound journal buried beneath a pile of dusty boxes. My grandfather's name was etched faintly on the cover. I sat down and began to read. The journal chronicled one of his hunting trips. His last. He wrote about strange sightings deep in the woods, odd sounds he couldn't explain. His descriptions were vivid, unsettling. He mentioned whispers in the wind, shadowy figures moving just out of sight. His entries grew more frantic and then nothing. The final page ended mid-sentence. I shivered. Whatever happened to him, he never came back. I couldn't shake the feeling that the journal was calling me. It was like my grandfather was still out there, waiting for someone to find him. The more I read, the more obsessed I became with retracing his steps. Early the next morning, while my family was still asleep, I grabbed the journal and headed into the woods. The path he described was faint, nearly overgrown, but I could make it out if I followed the landmarks he mentioned. An old, twisted oak tree, a creek that ran dry, and a cluster of rocks shaped like jagged teeth. As I walked deeper into the forest, the atmosphere shifted. It was subtle at first, a slight chill in the air, a heaviness that made the silence feel oppressive. Then I started noticing the carcasses. Animals, rabbits, a deer, left out to rot, as if something had hunted them but had no intention of eating. The sight made my stomach turn. I pushed on, heart pounding as I found strange markings carved into the trees. They looked like symbols, but none I could recognize. Oddly, I felt a sense of familiarity, like I'd seen them before in a dream or a nightmare. As I moved further from the lodge, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. Even the wind seemed to stop. That's when I saw them. Footprints, but far too large and oddly shaped to belong to any animal I knew. They seemed to lead in the same direction I was going. My pulse quickened. The journal mentioned a ridge where my grandfather first heard whispers in the wind. He described a feeling of being watched. Now I knew exactly what he meant. With each step, the sense of something lurking, unseen, grew stronger. Still, I couldn't stop. I had to know what happened to him. The sun dipped below the horizon faster than I expected, and before long, the forest was shrouded in shadows. I fumbled with my flashlight, its weak beam barely cutting through the thick darkness. As I pressed forward, the whispers started. Soft at first, almost like a breeze. But they weren't natural. They were voices, too faint to understand, but unmistakably human. Or at least something pretending to be. My heart raced as the whispers grew louder, seeming to circle me. I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Shadowy figures slipping between the trees, just out of sight. Panic clawed at my chest, but I kept moving, quicker now. I had to reach the ridge. The journal said it was close, but everything looked the same in the dark, and the trail seemed to shift under my feet. My flashlight flickered, sputtering like it was dying. Every time the light dimmed, the whispers surged, almost as if they were feeding off the darkness. Footsteps crunched behind me, slow and deliberate, matching my own. I turned, but there was nothing, just the endless black trees. Then I stumbled upon an old campsite. The remnants of a fire long burned out, surrounded by eerie carvings in the rocks. Those same strange symbols I'd seen earlier. Animal bones were scattered in a deliberate, disturbing pattern around the campsite. I recognized some of the bones. Deer, maybe, but others were unidentifiable, grotesque in their arrangement. The realization hit me like I finally reached the ridge, but the sense of relief I expected never came. Instead, the air grew unnaturally still, the oppressive silence pressing down on me. The whispers swirled around, no longer random but deliberate, as if they were calling my name. Every instinct screamed that something was watching me, lurking just beyond the tree line. Then they emerged. Shadowy figures, humanoid but wrong. Their limbs were too long, their movements jerky and unnatural. Eyes glowing faintly in the dark, fixed on me. My breath caught in my throat as they started closing in. Their presence overwhelming, suffocating. The whispers became clearer, speaking in tones too ancient to understand, yet somehow I knew they were meant for me. Heart pounding, I pulled out the journal, flipping through the pages with shaking hands. In the margins of one of the last entries, I saw a hastily scrawled note, a way to banish them. My mind raced as the figures drew closer. I had no choice but to act now. I began whispering the words from the journal under my breath, my voice barely audible over the rising wind. The creatures hesitated. For a moment I thought it was working, but they surged forward again. Had to run.
I've hunted in these mountains for years, so when word got around that a rogue bear was tearing up cabins, it didn't take long for folks to ask me to take care of it. I packed light, my rifle, a few traps, and my GoPro to document the whole thing. I want to show everyone how a real hunter works. No gimmicks, just skill and instinct. As I make my way deeper into the forest, I talk into the camera, explaining how to track a bear. Look for broken branches, claw marks, fresh scat. You learn to read the signs. I've done this enough times to know the patterns. But today something feels off. Around midday, I start noticing claw marks on the trees, but they're higher than a bear can reach. And then there's this sound. Not the usual forest noise, something else. A howl, long and drawn out. I tell myself it's the wind, maybe a wolf. I've seen strange things before. By dusk, I've got a camp set up, traps in place. The fire crackles as the night closes in. I try to relax, but I can't shake the feeling that something's not right. I feel eyes on me. Something is watching. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something moving outside my tent. Not the shuffling of an animal, not the rustling of wind through the trees. This was something heavier. Footsteps, deliberate. I froze, listening, my hand instinctively reaching for my rifle. Whatever it was, it didn't sound like a bear. After a few minutes, I forced myself up, unzipping the tent as quietly as possible. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint orange glow. I scanned the tree line but saw nothing. I grabbed my flashlight and moved toward the traps, heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the first trap, it had been sprung, but there was nothing caught in it. No bear, no animal at all. That's when I noticed my gear scattered around the camp. My GoPro, the one I had been using to document everything, was smashed, the lens shattered. My food supplies had been dumped out and kicked around like someone, or something, was trying to send a message. I felt a chill run down my spine as my flashlight caught something strange on a nearby tree. Symbols crudely etched into the bark. They weren't there before. They looked old, like something out of an ancient ritual, though I had no idea what they meant. As I tried to make sense of it all, I glanced down at the ground and noticed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Not bear tracks. Human footprints. They led from the edge of the forest right up to my camp. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching me, and they were still out there. I don't know what drove me to follow the symbols. Maybe it was the adrenaline, or maybe it was the gnawing feeling that I was in over my head. Either way, as soon as dawn broke, I packed up what was left of my gear and started tracking the strange carvings. They led deeper into the forest, each new symbol more elaborate than the last, almost like they were telling a story, one I didn't want to understand. The air felt heavier the farther I went, like the trees themselves were closing in on me. The symbols became more frequent, more intricate. Some were etched into the bark, others painted in a dark, dried substance that I didn't want to think too much about. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that eyes were following me from the shadows. Finally, I reached a clearing. It was small, overgrown, but in the center something caught my eye. A crude shrine made of animal bones and twisted branches, all centered around a large skull, probably a bear's. The bones had been arranged in strange patterns, almost like offerings. The bear wasn't just some rogue animal to these people. It was their protector, their god maybe. I stood there for a moment, trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing. That's when I heard it. Footsteps again, but this time they were closer. I turned, scanning the trees, but whoever or whatever was out there wasn't hiding anymore. Shadows moved between the trunks, deliberate, stalking. It hit me then. I wasn't the hunter. Not anymore. I was the prey. These people, whoever they were, believed the forest was theirs, and I was trespassing. The sun was setting, and the woods were coming alive with movement. They were closing in. Panic hit me as I turned and bolted into the forest. The shadows moved faster now, closing in, and I could hear them. Twigs snapping, whispers carried on the wind. Every time I thought I had a way out, something blocked my path. A crude trap. Ropes, Spikes hidden in the underbrush, animal bones scattered as warnings. They'd been expecting me. I ducked, dodged, tried to move silently, but they were always one step ahead. My instincts kicked in. I used every bit of hunting knowledge I had. But no matter how hard I tried to shake them, the locals knew this forest better than I ever could. My breathing grew ragged as I stumbled into a narrow ravine. Dead end. I could hear them coming, their chanting growing louder, like some sick ritual. I pressed my back to the cliffside, rifle in hand, but I knew it was useless. They emerged from the trees, faces painted with the same symbols I'd seen earlier, crude weapons in hand. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their eyes told me everything. They believed the forest had already claimed me. And now they were here to finish the job.